everyone. This is Timothy Mark with Alexandria.
How's everybody doing today?
And we are the Tickle Trunk of Horrors. And today's show is going to be quite an interesting show. But before we get into that, let's talk about the different platforms that this podcast plays on. It plays on Spreaker.com, where we get the majority of our listeners. And we have the shows on iTunes, sometimes Tumblr, although I haven't put it on Tumblr in quite a while, and YouTube. So that's the different platforms that we're on. And that song, the theme song for the show, is from Ryan Doherty. He did an awesome job on the theme song, and he's out of the UK. He has a website, ryandoherty-music.com. Just type in Ryan Doherty Music and his website should come up, and or you can type in the full thing, ryandoherty-.com. And he definitely has a lot of great songs on there. And he was gracious enough to do that song for us.
And we actually had him as a guest on the podcast a while back, talking about his music. So very thankful and grateful that he created the new intro for Tickle Trunk of Horrors.
Where's our theme song now? That's our theme song.
And I love the wolves. Doherty. I love how he sort of incorporated the wolves into that. And if you take a moment and really listen to the music, you'll hear the wolves in the intro music. So I really, really love it. Very grateful. Thank you for creating that for us, Ryan. And before we go into today's topic, let's discuss a recent passing in the horror world is Margot Kidder. I was actually stunned all over social media yesterday when I was reading that she passed away on Mother's Day, which was Sunday. I never expected that in a million years. Only 69 years young, and there, it was still under investigation how she passed away in her home, but I was flabbergasted.
Her stage name is Margot Kidder. Her real name is Margaret Ruth Kidder. She was born October 17th, 1948, and she died May 13th, 2018. And known for the Superman films with Christopher Reeve, Amityville, quite a few films. She's probably got over 50 films that she was in, including the Mel Gibson version of Maverick that came out in '94. So yeah,
she was a well-known, well-established, and well-thought-of actress. And again, I was just stunned. I mean, it did say that she had a real rough life. I think she suffered from bipolar, and she was homeless at one time.
She lost all her teeth, had to have dentures put in.
But she was a scrappy fighter because she was always trying to bring attention to mental health issues, which I think is awesome when a celebrity can use their celebrity status and bring items that need to be to the forefront using their attention. I think that's great.
So we can be sad for the world, the film world, but we can be happy for her because now she's embraced death, and she's on the next journey, the next phase of her existence, which is in the spirit world. And actually in 1974, I believe it was, she did the movie Black Christmas. Yeah, it was in 1974.
Wow.
That's the year I was born.
Wow. And then, whoa, you told everybody how old you are.
Hey, I'm 44 years old. I don't hide it. That's my age. I'm good.
Well, that's not even old in any ways. You're only as old as you think you are. Yeah. But really, again, I'm still stunned about that. I guess you always think people, like I always think my parents are going to be around forever. And then when you receive news, it kind of hits you like a ton of bricks. But really, death is something that we all have in common, and death comes to all of us, and there's nothing we can do about it, and it doesn't matter.
We shouldn't want to do nothing about it.
We should just embrace it as the next phase of our journey, because it doesn't matter how much money you have, you cannot cheat death. There's just no way that you can, and you should just use it as your boarding pass to the next flight or to the next destination in your journey. So, I mean...
Yeah.
That's the way I look at it. It's just a boarding pass to another dimension. So, again, today's show is going to be really, really interesting, and something that I've been interested in for a long period of time. And as we go more into the show, you'll realize why. It's
Bugaboo.
It's not bugaboo. It's two-tier podcast. It's
No. Bugaboo. You know what Bugaboo? Bugaboo. All right, today's show's on fairy photography.
Fairies
if you ever heard,
and fairy photography.
Right, and if there's different types of fairy, if you ever heard the term Bugaboo, Bugaboo is actually a fairy.
From where?
The UK.
Ooh, okay. So I hope this podcast will be very informative and very enlightened. And again, fairies, if you don't know what a fairy is, it's considered, the other names are fae, or fae folk. And really from fairy is the realm of the fays. And it's really a type of mythical being, or really a legendary creature in European folklore, a form of spirit often described as metaphysical, supernatural, or preternatural. So that's the different names of fairies. Again, they can be grouped with pixies as well, and they're originated in Europe. And really, the English fairy derives from the Old French form, and I'm going to spell it F-A-I-E-R-I-E, and it's a derivation from fae, from vulgar Latin fata, F-A-T-A. And in Old French romance, a fae or a fée was a woman that was skilled in magic and who knew the power and virtue of words, of stones, and of herbs. And I guess I could be considered a fée or a fae in Old French romance, because I do those as well. And fairy again was used to represent an illusion or an enchantment, and the land of the fays collectively, the inhabitants thereof, or an individual such as a fairy knight. And I really haven't seen too many fairy knights, or I haven't read any stories about fairy knights, so that's a new one on me.
It might have came from a different version of the fairy. For all the comic book fans out there who are fans of the Spider-Man comic books, you've heard of the Hobgoblin. Well, guess what? The Hobgoblin is a Scottish fairy.
Oh, there you go.
Yep.
And various folklore traditions refer to fairies such as wee folk, good folk, people of peace, and fair folk. And in Welsh, it is spelt Tylwyth, Teg. And really, again, the term fairy is sometimes used to describe any magical creature. They lump it all together, including goblins, gnomes, and
bugaboos.
Right, and the term describes only a specific type of ethereal creature, or another word is a sprite.
Now, here's a term that is not familiar with the people in the United States or North America, but it is familiar with the people of Scotland, and it's brownies. They consider brownies fairies.
Right, and you'll get the gist of what we're trying to say in this podcast, and I'm going to go into that really historical origins include various traditions of the Celts, and that includes the Britons, the Welsh people, the Gaelics, which were the Irish, Scot, Germanic people, and of Middle French medieval romances. And again, fairy was used, the meaning as an adjective was enchanted, as again, and they're using the term fairy knight, or we know what a fairy queen is.
Banshees are fairies too, and hobgoblins are actually known as guardians. They are actually guardian fairies, but banshees have different missions or intentions or whatever. There's different type of banshees within the fairy category.
Wow. Pardon me. And really, the term fairy really became sort of a generic term for various enchanted creatures during the late Middle English period, and really literature of the Elizabethan era conflated elves with fairies of Romance culture, rendering these terms sort of interchangeable, meaning they lumped them together and the terms were really interchangeable. And it was really in the Victorian era and the Edwardian era that they saw a real heightened increase of the interest in fairies. And the Celtic revival really, people that were interested in Celtic traditions, this revival really cast fairies as part of Ireland's cultural heritage. And
well, I want to go back to Scotland for a minute. I know, and one of the most famous fairies in Scotland is called Black Annis, and Black Annis is haunts the hills in Scotland. So that's a pretty
different kind of a fairy than we're all, instead of looking at Tinkerbell and Peter Pan, that's another, and now I'm going to kind of go into more of different descriptions that sort of Timothy sort of led me into that. And really, fairies are generally described as human in appearance and having magical powers. And fairies of various kinds have been reported through the centuries, and a lot of the appearances ranging from quite tiny to the size of a human child. And these small sizes could be magically assumed rather than constant. So they were not constantly that size, they could be magically assumed. And some smaller fairies could really expand their figures, meaning they could make themselves bigger to imitate humans. And on Orkney, in Scotland, fairies were described as short in stature, dressed in dark gray, sometimes even in armor. And in some folklore, fairies have green eyes. And some depictions of fairies show them with actual footwear, and sometimes they're depicted as being barefoot.
Well, let me tell you this: in the marshes of Scotland, there's a gas, and the gas has flickering flames that hover over the ground on the marshes. And that's where people claim to have seen the jack-o'-lantern. I know that we're talking about fairies right now, or the will-o'-wisp. And but it's these marshy gases that intrigue people, and the fairies that appear in them will actually lead people in Scotland to their death
yes,
in the bogs.
I've heard of that several occasions because I am of Scottish descent, and it is almost the same process of the Pied Piper, but the gas and the interest in is leading the people to their death.
Yes.
So that's amazing. And there's another thing I want to talk about too in regards to fairies: wings. Wings, while they were common in Victorian and later artworks, wings are rare in folklore. Fairies flew by means of magic, and that doesn't mean they used wings. Sometimes they were perched on ragwort stems or the back of birds. So according to folklore, they didn't use wings. They used magic, and then they actually rode on the back of birds. And some modern illustrations often include them riding on dragonfly or them having butterfly wings, but that is truly a modern invention.
Well, in 1962, which is not that far back, I mean, for a lot of the younger generation, I'm sure y'all like, damn, that's a long ways back. But 1962 is not that far away. And in 1962, a Somerset farmer's wife told her how she lost her way the Berkshire Downs, and she was lost, and a little green man appeared and guided her back on track.
Wow.
And then he disappeared. So fairies can be both male and female.
That's interesting. And a lot of folklorists and people that study myths have variously depicted fairies as the unworthy dead and the children of Eve, a kind of demon, a species independent of humans, an older race of humans, or even some people say they're fallen angels. And the folkloristic elements combined Celtic, Germanic, and Greco-Roman elements. Yeah. So that's very, very strange that they were considered, and actually King James in his dissertation, Demology, stated the term fairy referred to illusionary spirits. Actually, King James said that fairies were demonic entities and that prophesied to consort with and transported the individuals they served. And in medieval times...
Well, that was his opinion.
Right.
I mean, that was his opinion.
King James, I mean, obviously...
I mean, we know a lot of kings and queens and presidents and emperors and everything. They've had a lot of different opinions. And a woman on holiday in Cornwall, actually, was with her daughter. And she came across, if you remember when I talked to you about the 1962 incident with the woman with the green man, she actually came across a small green man with a pointed hood and ears. And, so that was another account in the 20th century of the little green man who wasn't an alien, who was a fairy.
Wow. And I mean, people through time have really twisted, contorted, and made fairies kind of suit their own uses. And this is one far-fetched story about a Christian tenant who held that fairies were a class of demoted angels, and one story described a group of angels revolting and God ordering the gates of heaven shut, and those still in heaven remained angels, those in hell became demons, and those that were caught in between were called or became fairies.
Well, a lot of people used to fear the fairies. You talked about the ignorance and opinion of King James. And King James was right on some level. Not all fairies were bad. Some were. And so we need to know that the title fairy is a subject that has a lot of, different varieties underneath it. It's like if you say vegetable, like I don't like that vegetable. Well, hell, there's a lot of different vegetables. And some of them may kill you. But some of them may give you pleasure. You don't know. But there's a lot of different vegetables. But it's the same thing with fairies. There's a lot of different fairies.
That's right. And even in a lot of pagan societies, there's a theory that is held that fairies were originally worshipped as minor deities, such as, and we've all heard of the term nymphs and tree spirits. And that's interesting as well. That I've never. Again, I've heard of the term nymphs, but and as well tree spirits.
Nymph, NYMPH, right?
Right.
Short for nymphomaniac, which is a seductress that can never be satisfied, and is always driving men nuts into their deaths. Nymphomaniacs, but that would be a whole different.
Nymphs.
That would be a whole different podcast right there.
That's right. And again, there was also a theory of that fairies were spirits of the dead, and they derived from many factors in common of various folklore and myths, some or similar tales of both ghosts and fairies.
We know as paranormal researchers that theory is complete bullshit. So they're not spirits of the dead. I mean, we know that to be bullshit. So. There's a lot of different theories about a lot of different things that don't mean the theories are right,
That's right. So that's just some, and they're even called fairies are called elementals as well. They were intelligent species, distinct from, different from humans and angels, and they were also alchemists, and they were gnomes, all these particular different names and everything like that. So there's a whole lot of different names in different cultures that have used fairies, and they're always saying that fairies actually do a lot of less harmful pranks, and they can even tangle the hair of sleepers into fairy locks, or they call them elf locks. They actually steal small items, and they can lead a traveler astray. And the more dangerous behaviors that were attributed to fairies is sudden death might have stemmed from a fairy kidnapping, the evidence a corpse or a magical inclination in regards to fairies as well.
I just want to touch on base on what that lady with her daughter, how she described the little green man with the pointy hood and the pointy ears. If you take, again, I'm going back to the comic book, but it's art that's reflecting life. And so the hobgoblin actually was created out of that, out of the Scottish little green man with pointy ears and a pointy hood. And if you know, he throws jack-o'-lanterns. So if you go back to the story of the marshes where they've seen the jack-o'-lanterns, same place where they've seen the green man, the hobgoblin is actually that fairy, but it's incorporated into the comic book. And I'm a Spider-Man fan, so it's definitely incorporated into the a good comic book, good series.
And a lot of you out there may or may not have heard the term changeling. I certainly am familiar with the term changeling, but really a considerable amount of lore about fairies revolves around this term changelings. And fairy children were left in the place of changelings are fairy children that were left in the place of stolen human babies. In particular, folklore describes how to prevent the fairies from stealing human babies and substituting changelings. And they also abducted older people as well.
Yeah, it says a human child might be taken due to many factors at the time by a fairy, because the fairy would take the human child and to act as a servant, to the love of a human child, or malice. And so maybe the fairy was wanting the love of a human child. That might be one of the reasons why they took the human child, or they might have took it out of malice, or they may have took it so it would have grew up to be a servant.
And another thing, the belief in fairies was so prevalent that there are various cultures that have protective charms against fairies. And in terms of these protective charms, it's told that you could wear your clothing inside out. Church bells would ward them off. St. John's wort, the herb, and four-leaf clovers are regarded as effective. And in Newfoundland, Canada, most people that are from Newfoundland, Canada are of Irish descent, and in Newfoundland, the folklore there is the most popular type of fairy protection is bread, varying from stale bread to hardtack, or a slice of fresh homemade bread. And bread is really associated with the home and the hearth, and as well as with industry and the taming of nature, and as such seem to be disliked by some kinds of fairies.
Let me tell you something. One of the reasons too that they would leave their fairy children, instead of just taking the human children, and just kidnapping them and not leaving a child, they would leave the fairy child. And one of the reasons this is because it is said that fairy children needed human breast milk in order to survive. And actually it's pretty funny, because if you go on YouTube, there's a video, and I know this is off topic, and I'm going to get right back on topic in a minute, but if you go on YouTube, there's a video of a woman who walks into the break room, and she gets creamer, and she puts the creamer in her milk, and she's on a security camera, but she don't know it. And then she takes her breast and she squirts her breast milk into the creamer jug before she puts it back into the refrigerator. That was ridiculous, but yeah.
Okay.
But anyway, going back to the fairies, yeah, the reason why they leave their child is said that they need the human breast milk to survive.
Wow. And really, in much of Celtic folklore, baked goods are a traditional offering to the wee fairy folk, and as are cream and butter. And the prototype of food, and therefore a symbol of life, bread was again one of the most common protections against fairies. And before going out to a very fairy haunted place, it was customary to put a piece of dry bread in one's pocket.
Well, a lot of people don't realize, because you hear about people just eating bread, and they don't realize that it's a cheap bodybuilding meal, because each piece of bread, depending on what brand you get, has 4 to 5 grams of protein. So you are getting a protein source out of the bread. So if you eat 4 slices of bread with 2 sandwiches, or if just the 4 pieces of bread by themselves, you're going to get 16 to 20 grams of protein with that bread. And so bread would be considered, even in the ancient times, it would be considered something of
value.
Because it did have protein in it as well.
And another example of this in County Wexford, Ireland, in 1882, it was reported that if an infant is carried out after dark, a piece of bread is wrapped in its bib or dress, and this protects it from any witchcraft or evil. So again, mentioning that. And bells also have a very ambiguous role while they protect against fairies, and the fairies riding on horseback, such as the Fairy Queen, often have bells in their harness. So we have some of different things to protect yourself from fairies, and some things that I would never even think of.
Yeah, it's when you think of Tinkerbell, that's the most popular fairy in the North America, probably around the world. That's probably the most well-known fairy is Tinkerbell. And Tinkerbell, you would think that anybody that wanted to get rid of a fairy could just take a fairy swatter, because she flies around like a fly.
Oh my God! And you'd mentioned the term brownies in Scotland too, right?
Yeah.
And they were known to be driven off by given clothes. And so some folk tales recounted that they were offended by inferior quality of the garments given to them.
Wow.
So, that's just very, very, unreal that they had these different techniques to get rid of a fairy. And again, there's been just so many legends. In Scotland, again, it was peculiar to the fairy women to assume the shape of deer, while witches became mice. There's just so many different legends in regards to assuming different features. And again, the most common feature of the fairy is the use of magic to disguise appearance. And fairy gold is notoriously unreliable, appearing as gold when paid, but soon therefore reveals itself to be leaves or gingerbread cakes. So what they can do is that if you're given fairy gold, it will magically turn into something that it's not supposed to be.
Well, okay, but the topic of the show, now we'll give you an overview of the what fairies are. The topic of the show is actually fairy photography. So let's look into the earliest form of fairy photography that we're aware of at this time, and that is the Cottingley fairies. And they were taken between 1901. Well, no, the photographer lived between 1901. But in the early 1900s, this photographer, Elsie Wright, took fairy photography. In her photography, she put little fairies in the picture. Now, we can understand that a lot of people did not know that this was like fake fairies. So this photography was taken very seriously, and people were believing that she actually photographed fairies with this child.
And in the Cottingley fairies, the first of the 5 photographs was taken by her in 1917, and it shows Frances Griffiths with the alleged fairies in the photograph.
Yeah, that's 1917. I didn't know the exact date, but Elsie was 16 years old and Frances was 9.
And the part that's kind of piques my interest is that these pictures really came to the attention of the writer Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and we all know that he was the individual that wrote Sherlock Holmes, and he actually used them to illustrate an article on fairies that he had been commissioned to write for the Christmas 1920 edition of the Strand magazine. And we all know that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was a spiritualist and was enthusiastic about these photographs, and he kind of interpreted them as clear and visible evidence of psychic phenomena. I don't know how you would equate fairy photography as clear and visible evidence as of psychic phenomena.
Well, back in those days, of course, today we know more. We know better than to believe that. But back in those days, people would definitely believe it because there's stuff they were seeing with their own eyes. And one of the little girls that was taken, the younger girl, the one that was 9, here's a letter from her where she refers to the fairy. I'll actually read the letter. And it's to her friend in South Africa. So it's from Frances Griffiths. And this is her letter. She says, I am learning French, geometry, cookery, and algebra at school now. Dad came home from France the other week after being there 10 months, and we all think the war will be over in only a few days. I'm sending 2 photos, both of me, one of me in a bathing costume in our backyard, while the other is me with some fairies. Elsie took that one. So these 2 children definitely pulled the wool over a lot of people's eyes.
Well, really, we have to put this into perspective that public reaction to these fairy photography images were mixed. Some accepted the images as genuine, but others believed that they had been faked. And the interest in the Cottingley fairies gradually started to really decline after 1921. And again, yet, after the girls got married and lived abroad for a time, the photographs continued to hold the public imagination. And in 1966, a reporter from the Daily Express newspaper, they traced Elsie, who by then had returned to the UK, and Elsie left open the possibility that she believed she had photographed her thoughts, and the media once again became interested in the story. So that's,
Well, that girl, she stayed a liar her whole life then, basically, because when you look at those pictures, one of the fairies is playing a musical instrument, and it's obvious that what it looks like almost a cutout of some sort that they had in their backyard, because we know, or they had in their room or wherever the picture was taken. We know one of the photographs was taken outside, but it looked no more like than what a children's toy would be, or a homemade toy of these little figures playing instruments, and they clearly are fake.
Yeah, but then we jump forward, and it says in the early 1980s, Elsie and Frances both admitted that the photographs were faked using cardboard cutouts of fairies copied from a popular children's book of the day, and but Frances maintained that the 5th and final photograph was genuine, and the photographs and the 2 of the cameras that were used are now on display in the Natural Science and Media Museum in Bradford, England.
The 5th photograph was real. That's what she says.
Yes.
I don't know actually what the 5th photograph was. I know that I see the first of the 5 photographs. The first one, which was in 1917, is clearly the cardboard cutouts. And I think the only reason that it would be in a museum is to showcase the extraordinary lying ability of these little 2 girls, who would also, all the way up until they became very old, would maintain lies. And I don't know which one is the 5th one. I wish I did.
And it's also interesting, and I'm sort of disappointed that, or maybe not disappointed, but Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, his article in the December 1920 issue of The Strand contained 2 higher resolution prints of the 1917 photographs, and that magazine sold out within days of the publication. And at that time, to protect the girls, being anonymous, their names were changed. They were called Alice and Iris. And Doyle hoped that if the photographs convinced the public of the existence of fairies, then they would more readily accept other psychic phenomena. And he ended his particular article, the 1920 Strand article, with these words, and in quotations: "The recognition of their existence will jolt the material 20th century mind out of its heavy ruts in the mud, and will make it admit that there is a glamour and mystery to life. Having discovered this, the world will not find it so difficult to accept the spiritual message supported by physical facts which has already been put before it." End of quotations.
Okay, so I'm going to tell you this. I've looked now at photographs 1 through 4, and they're all the cardboard cutouts. And as I look at the fifth one's definitely not the same cardboard cutouts. It looks like it was made of something different. I mean, you can see it right there. This is the 5th picture that they say is real.
Yeah, like, I mean, I don't really, they're not using the same, like
not
I said,
the same cutouts they did for the first 4 pictures. So now that I understand which is the 5, the order of the photographs, yeah, the lady lied all the way to the end. Yeah, she did.
Unbelievable. And really, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle used later photographs in 1921 to illustrate a second article in the Strand magazine, in which he described other accounts of fairy sightings, and the article formed the foundation of his 1922 book that was called The Coming of the Fairies. And as before, the photographs were received with mixed credibility, and skeptics noted that the fairies looked suspiciously like the traditional fairies of nursery tales or nursery rhymes, and that they had very fashionable hairstyles. So I guess fashionable hairstyles of the day.
Well, the little girls, I mean, well, the picture of Frances or whatever, these girls were geniuses, man, to do what they did and be. It just shows, and I can say stupidity of the people at the time, but I can understand that people didn't understand photography. But these little 2 girls did, and they knew what the secret was, and they pulled the wool over a lot of people's eyes.
And it's amazing too that they sort of hoodwinked somebody like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who was big into spirituality. He was a big spiritualist, and again in 1983, the cousins admitted in an article published in the magazine The Unexplained that the photographs had been faked. And although both had maintained that they really had seen fairies. So they're saying in 1983 that they faked the photographs, but they maintained the fact that they thought they really had seen fairies. And again, they had, Elsie had copied illustrations of dancing girls from a popular children's book of the time. And they drew wings on them. So then they cut out the cardboard figures, and they supported them with hat pins, and they disposing of their props in the beck once the photograph had been taken. So really, again, but it says that the cousins disagreed about the 5th and the final photograph that you mentioned.
Yeah, because they're not using the same cutouts, But fairy photography, that was the most famous case of fairy photography. But fairy photography since then became, when they found out that those pictures were fake, has become a big thing, actually. Where
wow.
a lot of people are now, instead of like faking fairies being around them, now they're dressing kids up as fairies. Yep.
Well, that boggles me. But we're all familiar. Remember Arthur C. Clarke?
No, I don't. Explain it.
Well, Arthur C. Clarke used to have a TV show that I watched all the time, and they actually...
What was the TV show called?
It's called World of Strange Powers.
Okay.
So in 1985, they had an interview on Arthur C. Clarke's World of Strange Powers, and they said that Elsie and Francis were too embarrassed to admit the truth after fooling Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes. So they were actually, they pulled the wool over his eyes, and they were too embarrassed after he believed it. So they figured a guy that wrote Sherlock Holmes, if they could fool him.
Well, clearly, he's the author of Sherlock Holmes, but he was no Sherlock Holmes. I mean, you know, you probably could have sold him a beach house in the middle of the desert. You know, you dig up a little water, throw a little water on there and call it a beach house. But, you know, he didn't seem to be that bright of a person, even though his works...
Well, he was a genius for creating Sherlock Holmes.
Oh, yeah, without a doubt.
But, I mean, and if you know anything about spiritualism... hopefully in the future we will do an episode on the Hamilton House in Winnipeg. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle actually in the beginning of the 1900s came to Winnipeg to do seances at the Hamilton House. So he was a big spiritualist. And really, Francis died in 1986. Elsie in 1988, and prints of their photographs of the fairies, along with a few other items, including a first edition book of Doyle's book called The Coming of the Fairies, was sold at auction in London for over £21,000 in 1998.
Well, that's a lot of Roseanne bars. Are we pounds? How does that equate to dollars?
Well, I think
what is a pound?
Pound sterling is, I think, in my perspective with Canadian dollars, pound sterling is 1.5 or one and a half times more than Canadian dollars. So you'd have to check your currency rate in regards to that.
Yep. Yeah, you got to do the USD conversion since I am using United States currency, but I don't know what a pound. It's just funny to me. But go ahead.
And you have Antique Roadshow in America too.
Yeah. And
it's not funny, but it's Francis's daughter appeared in an episode of the television series. This was an Antique Roadshow in Belfast, on broadcast on the BBC One in 2009, and she brought with her to the Antique Roadshow the photographs and one of the cameras given to the girls by Doyle. And the woman told the expert that she believed, as her mother had done, that the fairies in the fifth photograph were genuine. So the daughter of one of these appeared in Antique Roadshow trying to say that, again, that the fifth image was genuine.
Well, the fifth image is different from the first four because they used some other different material to make the fairy. But yeah, they were definitely all fake, even the fifth one. Yeah.
And it's also interesting too that in 1997, the films Fairy Tale: A True Story and Photographing Fairies were inspired by the events surrounding the Cottingley fairies. And again, very interesting that 2 films were done.
A lot of films have been done about fairies, but you're talking about specifically those photographs,
right?
Yeah. Well, there you go. There you go, Antique Roadshow.
And like I said, it's a hard one for me to swallow that these 2 girls using cutouts and then drawing wings that they could fool Sir Arthur Conan Doyle with fairy well, it shocks me because he was into spiritualism, and I think what was really happening here, folks, that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wanted the public to believe in psychic phenomena so bad that he hoped that the public would be duped like he was, and then he could feed them anything.
Well, I heard a story about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle there. The thing about it is, here's the story. Why he started believing in paranormal. Not because of the fairy photographs. What happened was this. He was outside of a cigar shop one day.
Oh, please.
No, I'm serious.
Sir Arthur Conan Doyle.
I am telling you, he went to a cigar shop
Where was it?
Over there where he was. And,
where was that?
I don't forget. But listen to the story of how he became a believer in the paranormal.
In psychic phenomena.
Because he went to go get a drink at what he thought was a place to just get drink and candy from. And there was somebody smoking a cigar around the corner, and he seen this smoke. And he followed it around and tried to talk to it because he thought it was a spirit.
It's not ectoplasm.
And it was cigar smoke.
It wasn't ectoplasm, please, because there was enough of that fake
No, that's
stuff
a whole different podcast.
I know, but he was involved in doing seances at Hamilton House in Winnipeg. But that's another podcast in regards to Sir Arthur Conan
Doyle.
Doyle.
Do one on him. I mean,
but anyways,
I would do one on ectoplasm for sure.
But I think
that's very interesting because that was another con thing going on.
And that happened in Winnipeg when Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was at Hamilton House seances. So he was
not too bright of a fella, but he had a hell of an imagination when he wrote them books.
But you know what? Let's kind of step forward before we end this topic on fairy photography and the Cottingley fairies and the scam of Sir Arthur Conan, putting the wool over his eyes. In 2017, a further 2 fairy photographs were presented as evidence that the girls' parents were a part of the conspiracy. Now they're saying in 2017 the girls' parents were part of this sham. Dating from 1917 and 1918, both photographs were poorly executed copies of two of the original fairy photographs. One was published in 1918 in the Spear newspaper, which was before the originals had been seen by anyone outside the girls' immediate family. So now the parents were trying to chime in and giving 2 poorly executed copies of 2 of the original fairy photographies. So it was just not the girls, it was now their parents involved in this whole conspiracy. And you know what, I really think that this was awful, that this sham was actually pulled and there were so many people that were believing. This really gives people in the spiritual realm a bad name when you have people. This is an example of fakers.
You know what came out of it? The good thing that came out of it was special photography, using props as the children did. Not just that, but also the hobgoblin. I'm going to say it again in the Spider-Man comic book. I want to touch on some other things that's going on because I think we've about wrapped up the fairy subject. Some other things that's going on in the world. As we know, in Jerusalem, we now have the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem, and with that being there was a preacher there that gave the prayer, and the preacher that gave the prayer there is the same preacher who said that all Jews will go to hell. I thought that was a poor choice in having that preacher give the prayer at the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem.
Well, who is the smarty, or not the smarty, that asked him to do it?
What? No, because see, now you're trying to attack somebody, and I ain't going there.
I'm not trying, but who is the one that asked him to perform the blessing?
That I don't know, and I don't know if...
wouldn't they research that this guy's a screwball?
Well, if he has a congregation, has a following, and maybe they were unaware of what he had said, until, of course, the media is going to find out every little thing because they're trying to attack the president anyway. So they're going to find out any little thing that they can to make it look like a bad situation.
Yeah, but shouldn't people do their research?
Yeah, I thought it was a poor choice of a preacher there, definitely. But I mean, what true preachers could you have had there to give the prayer? I mean, what real preachers is out there in the world today? Most of them are just trying to, get money.
Most of them are driving their Mercedes around and, flashing their expensive jewelry. Their wives are wearing, having their hair, their makeup, their nails.
Now, we're referring to the preachers in North America. I understand that we have listeners in other countries.
We're not being disrespectful.
But for what we're going through over here in North America with our preachers, is they're really on a con job over here in the continent of North America, and they're really scamming a lot of people. That's not to say that they're the same in other countries, but we're just referring to the ones here in our
country. The difficulties that we have in North America.
Yeah, and so we want to clarify that. But yeah, it was definitely a poor choice. But you got to know better in Canada with your prime minister. He's a fairy as well. He's not just a fairy, but he's a sympathizer with some unsavory people.
Oh, let's put this into perspective that the prime minister that we do have in Canada now, Justin Trudeau, is really has really disappointed so many Canadians. We had such great expectations, we had such high hopes, and they were dashed sooner than anticipated. Where he has now opened the floodgates to our country, where we're accepting terrorists and people that are being thrown out of other countries, and we're just becoming overrun. So very disappointed in our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
You know, one of the things too that I want to talk about is in Turkey. In Turkey they have I think it's Mount Ararat, where they say the
Noah's
Ark landed, and I think that we should do a show on that, because I know there's been 1,000 shows done on it, but I would really like to go up there and find that ark, you know.
And that would be, one of the greatest mysteries uncovered, and I think that search will continue until it is finally found. And I mean, it's a quest that is insatiable, and hopefully that it will be found.
So if anybody's got any questions, complaints, or concerns, you can email us at World Paranormal Research Society at gmail.com. Again, that's World Paranormal Research Society at gmail.com. You got anything else for the people? Or?
No, I'd like to thank again. We've got some new awesome theme music from Ryan Doherty, and very grateful. Thank you for creating that for Tickle Trunk of Horrors. We hope that you enjoyed this episode on fairies and fairy photography, specifically the Cottingley fairies that we touched on. And again, we enjoy bringing different topics that are sort of gone down the less beaten path.
And if you, again, Ryan Doherty music, check out his website. Awesome music on there. Talk to y'all later.
Bye-bye.